The executioner forced the victim face down into the dirt. He used a short, heavy blade to slice through the thick layers of skin and muscle on either side of the spine. He peeled the flesh back to expose the rib cage. Then he severed the ribs from the backbone, one by one, and folded them outward. Finally, he reached into the chest cavity, grabbed the intact lungs, and pulled them through the opening. He draped the organs over the splayed bone. For a few brief seconds as the victim suffocated, the lungs inflated and deflated. The massive wound looked like a pair of fleshy, beating wings. This was the blood eagle. Most of what we know about the Vikings was written by people who had good reasons to make them look as terrifying as possible, which makes separating fact from legend genuinely difficult. But the blood eagle is their most infamous legacy. According to the Norse sagas, it was a specialized ritual execution. It only shows up in two specific accounts, and both victims were defeated royals. One was Halfdan Longleg, a Norwegian prince. The other was King Aelle of Northumbria. Halfdan Longleg was the son of King Harald Fairhair. According to the Orkneyinga saga, Halfdan burned a powerful jarl named Ragnvald to death inside a house along with 60 of his men. Ragnvald's son, Thorfinar, hunted Halfdan down. When Thorfinar caught him, he ordered his men to hold the prince down. The saga notes that Thorfinar carved an eagle on Halfdan's back with a sword. He cut all the ribs from the backbone, drew the lungs out, and dedicated the kill to the god Odin. The second victim, King Aelle, was executed by the Viking leader Ivar the Boneless. In the late 9th century, King Aelle had allegedly captured Ivar's father, Ragnar Lodbrok. Aelle threw Ragnar into a pit of venomous snakes and watched him die from the bites. Ivar and his brothers brought the great heathen army to England to get revenge. When Ivar's army captured York, they took King Aelle alive. The tale of Ragnar's sons describes Ivar ordering a skilled woodcarver to perform the blood eagle on Aelle. He chose a woodcarver because he needed a man who understood leverage and bone. He needed someone who knew how to separate parts without shattering them into useless fragments. Someone sat down and solved that exact problem. For centuries, historians and medical professionals assumed the blood eagle was just a physical impossibility. You can't just peel a human ribcage open like a book. The connective tissue and bone structure are too thick. But in 2022, a team of anatomists and medical researchers published a study in Speculum, a journal of medieval studies. They sat down and approached the blood eagle as an engineering problem. They wanted to figure out if an executioner could physically perform the ritual using only the tools available in the Viking Age. They concluded that it was possible, but it required a highly specific process. The researchers ran simulations using 3D anatomy software, mapping the exact structural integrity of the human ribcage. First, the executioner needed a sharp blade to remove the tough skin and deep muscle layers from the back. Elite Viking burials often contain single-edged fighting knives with rigid handles. These blades are practically identical to modern autopsy knives. An executioner could easily use one of these knives to flay the back open. Next came the bone. Severing the ribs from the spine is the hardest part. The 2022 study found that hacking at the back with a sword would shatter the ribs and ruin the organs inside. Sawing through the bone with a serrated knife would puncture the delicate pleural sac surrounding the lungs, preventing them from inflating. To break the thick bands of ligament anchoring the ribs to the thoracic spine, you need leverage. The executioner probably used a specialized Viking spearhead. Many Viking spears had a shallow metal hook near the base of the blade. The executioner slipped this blade under the rib, hooked the bone, and snapped it away from the spine from behind. He had to do this for 24 separate ribs, 12 on each side. It was a laborious, messy, and physically exhausting process. The executioner would be covered in blood, prying bone away from the spine joint by joint. Because of the sheer physical effort required, the blood eagle demanded the pacing of a calculated, deliberate performance. It required time, physical restraint, and an audience. The researchers also solved the timeline of the suffering. The saga accounts imply the victim was kept alive to feel the lungs draped over their shoulders, but human anatomy doesn't allow that. Opening the thoracic cavity from the back instantly equalizes the air pressure. The lungs immediately collapse. The victim would lose consciousness in a matter of seconds due to the massive drop in blood pressure. They would suffocate shortly after. The fluttering wings served only as a visual display for the onlookers, since the victim was already dead. The anatomy works, and the Vikings had the right tools. But the history has a massive hole in it. There is no contemporary Viking-era account that actually describes the blood eagle. The Vikings left behind no written history in books. They carved brief runes into stone, leaving their long-form stories to oral traditions. The earliest datable text we have that mentions the blood eagle is a skaldic poem called the Nutstrapa. A poet named Sigvatar wrote it in the early 11th century. The poem references the death of King Ela, which happened in the late 9th century. That leaves a gap of at least 100 years between the execution and the first time anyone wrote it down. Because of that gap, modern scholars are deeply divided on whether the blood eagle ever actually happened. Roberta Frank, a scholar of Old Norse literature, argued the entire ritual was just a giant misunderstanding. She suggested later writers misread early skaldic poetry. Skaldic poetry relied on heavy, complex metaphors called kennings. In Norse poetry, a carrion bird tearing at the back of a dead man on a battlefield was a common image for a warrior defeating his enemy. Frank argued that a later writer read a poetic line about an eagle cutting a man's back and took it literally. From there, the story grew. Christian monks amplified the literal translation. The Vikings were the terror of Christian Europe. When the Norse sacked the coastal monasteries, they sent a shockwave through the continent. The monks who survived wrote the chronicles. They described the Norse as heathens, sent by God to punish them for their sins. Chronicles about a demonic enemy ignore their trade networks. The writers focus entirely on their cruelty. Frank pointed out that the written accounts of the blood eagle get more elaborate as time goes on. The earliest mention in the Nutstrapa just says Ivar had an eagle cut on Ela's back. It is a vague description. A century later, the sagas add the part about severing the ribs with a sword. Another century later, the manuscript accounts add the detail of pulling the lungs out and spreading them like wings. Each new manuscript added a new layer of gore. The monks copied these texts in candlelit scriptoriums, painting the pagan past as barbaric to justify their present. British historian Ronald Hutton evaluated these sources and called the blood eagle almost certainly a Christian myth. In this view, the blood eagle was nothing more than Christian propaganda. But the physical evidence complicates that theory. On the Swedish island of Gotland, there are several large limestone monuments called picture stones. Norse craftsmen carved them during the Viking Age, long before the Christian monks wrote down the sagas. One of these monuments, known as the Stora Hammer's stone, depicts a very specific scene. It shows a man lying face down on his belly. Another man stands over him, driving a weapon into his back. Above them flies a bird of prey, alongside a triangular symbol associated with the god Odin and human sacrifice. The carving shows a controlled execution, entirely separate from the chaos of a battlefield. Executions usually target the neck or the chest, but this specific carving targets the spine. Some archaeologists look at that stone and see the first step of the blood eagle, carved by the people who actually performed it. If the stone depicts the blood eagle, it proves the visual concept predates the Christian manuscripts entirely. The Gotland stones exist. The anatomical study proves the procedure was physically possible. But the written records remain biased and centuries out of date. We will probably never know for sure if a Viking executioner actually cut a king's back open and pulled his lungs out. But the Norse built their entire military reputation on fear. They were vastly outnumbered by the kingdoms they raided across Europe. Psychological warfare was their greatest weapon. Whether they actually performed the blood eagle in the mud of Northumbria, or just let the horrifying stories spread across Europe, the effect on their enemies would have been exactly the same.